I don't know how many of you are a regular reader of the gentleman who's sitting next to me, David Brooks. But I wonder how many of you knew that he had taken a really fun road trip recently. He went overseas. He went to France and Spain. And the reason why is that David Brooks is a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen.
Were you there for them pulling the plug?
I missed that. I would have.
And David writes about, his column wasn't as much about the concert as it was a hook to get into a bigger issue about accountability. But you write about this moment when you're standing in a stadium in Spain and 56,000 Spaniards are singing,
I was born in the USA. And I was screaming, no, you weren't.
So we're not here to talk about the boss, but I use that just to say that what you witnessed, that firsthand experience, resonated very much with a recent Pew survey of global attitudes. And in Europe, the U.S. culture is even more popular today than it was in 2007. And in fact, the way that they view American business practices is also even more popular, not just in Europe, but in parts of the Arab world as well. When you start getting into President Obama, the numbers start going down a bit. They're higher than they were when President Bush left office, but they're starting to go down. And when you start asking about American foreign policy, the dips are in the double digit. So with that as a backdrop, what do you think American foreign policy challenges are in the world that the next US president is going to enter, is going to look like?
Yeah, I guess first understand the cultural differences when we go abroad, and these are deep. If you ask a bunch of people have done studies on this, and if you ask people from Asia to describe a group of fish, a fish tank, they will describe the vegetation, the water in the tank, the relationship between the fish. If you ask a bunch of Americans, we just pick the biggest fish in the tank and we describe that.
This is guys.
No, it's even true of, if you look at the isopods, how eyes move across the Mona Lisa, Asian eyes move across, American eyes just look at the eyes and the mouth of the woman in the portrait. And so the cultural differences are profound. And nonetheless, the stories that people can inhabit, what struck me about that Spanish thing is there were 56,000 Spaniards singing not only about I was born in the USA, but they knew the stone pony in Asbury Park. They enter into different worlds, and most people around the world have entered into the American world and say they know us and they inhabit parts of us. Now, to me, the biggest foreign policy challenge of the next 4 years is this. Imagine you're at a dinner table and everybody at the table has severe indigestion. So they're thinking about their own internal problems. That's sort of the world we're in. And so we're worried about our debt and our human capital and our inequality. The Europeans are worried about the euro. The Chinese worry about their growth problems. The Arabs are worried about the Arab Spring. We're all sort of locked in our own internal problems. And so managing that, to me, requires a foreign policy that is less about doctrine and more about understanding the particularities of their own internal problems and creating just sort of a helping relationship. How can you help us with our problems? How can we help you with your problems? So it's less doctrinal and more context-driven.
One country, KT, that is certainly dealing with a lot of internal problems these days is Pakistan. And in fact, this Pew Global Survey of Public Opinions showed, interestingly, that their low opinion of the United States is just as low today at 7% as it was when President Bush left office. So knowing as you know from your days in the National Security Council, the geostrategic importance of Pakistan as a nuclear power, majority Muslim country, neighbor of Afghanistan, harboring terrorists. Looking at the three-legged stool of development, defense, and diplomacy, how would you recommend the next president grapple with that country and that part of the world?
Well, Pakistan, I think we made a lot of mistakes, but we made them a long time ago. And one of the things that we did was we focused on military assistance to Pakistan at the expense of, we didn't do any domestic, we didn't do any education, we didn't do any military, we didn't do any civilian level assistance, foreign aid, what we used to call foreign aid. Now, the country that did was Saudi Arabia. In 1978, there was a grand siege of Mecca, and the Saudis, they were very nervous that what had just happened in Iran was going to happen to them, that they were going to be taken over by Islamic extremists and the royal family would lose its neck. So what they did was they made peace with those extremists, and they said, leave Saudi Arabia, but we will fund your efforts, and why don't you just go do all your things that you want to do and educate people, do it in Pakistan. And so they did. Pakistan was a country where there was no public education for people, one of the poorest countries in the world, but the Saudis pumped a lot of money into creating madrasas, schools. So if you were a Pakistani mom and you had a kid who had no future except maybe being a day laborer, you thought, I'm going to send him to this free school, this madrasa. Now the madrasas educated them, but they also were training grounds for a lot of extremists. So what we have seen is that every year those schools graduated more and more students, tens of thousands of students, and there weren't 10,000 students who were going to be Islamic extremists, but maybe there was only 1%. But what that has done is build up a core of very angry Pakistanis who want to export their revolution. Okay, so what do you do now? Today, I look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I've got to say, I don't think there's anything good we can do there. And in an era of dwindling budgets, I would rather spend my money elsewhere. It's too late for Pakistan to a large extent. You're not going to change 97% of the Pakistani public opinion to becoming pro-American. Once we get out of Afghanistan, whenever that is, we need Pakistan to get out. But once we get out, I think it's time to go to the Pakistanis and say, okay, we've had 10 years, we've given you $20 billion, mostly military assistance, and you have basically used a lot of that money to kill our people. We're out of here. If you want to go find friends elsewhere, but new friendship is going to be with India. Now, I would take the money that we've otherwise been using in that part of the world, and I would redirect it because I think the problems the new president's going to have, whoever he is, are threefold. One, there's going to be an immediate problem with how to deal with Iran. I mean, that's 2013 is going to be the year of Iran. It's either going to have nuclear weapons or we're going to have a war, or there's some miracle that's going to happen, like some kind of cyber attack that's going to delay it. The second problem, though, that the president's going to have in coming in is one that you're going to see coming, and that's the entire Arab Spring, the movie, but it's going to be the sequel. And that's going to be every one of these countries, which a lot of the economic and demographic problems they've had are going to come home to roost. I think Egypt starts having food shortages by the end of the year. Now, what does that do to a country like us? Well, we're good at stuff like that. We're really actually pretty good at foreign. I mean, look at all of you. This is what you do, right? We're very good at that. And I think where we need to do that is in Egypt, before Egypt goes the way that Iran went or that Pakistan went. That's a place where we could put our money and our efforts.
Well, I think that's...
Oh, and then I would just say those 100 nukes that are sitting in Pakistan.
that was about to get to
that's sort of a toughie. And what I would do is say that the best defense isn't over there, it's here. I would put money, U.S. defense budget is being debated today and tomorrow, all this week, about cutting the defense budget. I would say go ahead and cut some of it, but where you really want to put money in the defense budget is in missile defense and in intelligence and in cyber. All of those things will help you deal with Pakistan's 100 nuclear weapons.
I would somewhat disagree that it's impossible to turn it
Really?
around.
Fox News,
but
ABC.
No, but this is, I'm actually not speaking
from.
from the perspective of a journalist here. I'm really much more here in my hat as a trustee of Save the Children, where I have traveled to these places. And being in the northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan after the earthquake, and seeing the relief that was coming in from the United States and from the world, and the response of the people was really quite dramatic. And we opened a school in one of the refugee camps on the Indus River, and for the first time ever, girls went to school that day. The female literacy rate in the northwest frontier provinces is 1%, and so
There you go.
It's all about cyber. It's all about cyber.
But, so,
There it goes.
I don't know what that is.
When you touch it, it'll go away.
It goes away, but then you can't hear me. So I do think that you can, here comes another microphone, thank you. I think you can change attitudes, and I think we do see that happening around the world often, where you get into a situation, particularly a relief situation, and then stay on the ground to do the development work, which is what we do around the world in an awful lot of places. And, you know, that is obviously what you all are here to encourage, and I think that it is well worth encouraging, because it is a lot cheaper than war or even missile defense, and it speaks not only to our interest in terms of our national defense and against terrorism, but also to our interest as an economic entity, and then thirdly to our values. And that is a huge amount of what America is about. So at the same time that you have, you know, a number of people saying we hate America, they're also lining up to get visas to come here. And that happens all the time. When you have the lottery day, people are around the block in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in these countries to get into this country. So, you know, some of this is a disconnect having to do with answering polls, I think, but and what people think they're supposed to think. But it is also, I think, it is also a failure on our part to have adequately spread the message of what it is we are doing, both in the countries where we're doing it and in this country among our own people and especially in our own Congress.
Well, speaking of spreading the message, I'm supposed to spread the message to all of you that we are all live streaming. You can tweet your questions to #SmartPower. So I say that, and I'm going to open things up to all of you for your questions in just a moment. But first, David, let me ask you, Cokie mentioned economic interests. You write an awful lot about what's happening here in the U.S. with our economy. When you look at some of the statistics and you say that 11 out of the 15 of our biggest trading partners today were recipients of American foreign assistance, why does that message not get the U.S. Congress in this day and age writing a big fat check to American development?
Or anybody else.
Well, to be honest, in my view, the evidence on foreign aid is a mixed message. The evidence is hard. There are some things I think you can point to results which we're really good at. We're really good at healthcare. You can point to the results. We're really good at education. We're good at some of the humanitarian stuff. As far as tying a link between foreign aid and economic growth, personally, I think that link is hard to spot sometimes. We've spent a lot of time in a lot of big projects, which to my mind did not lead to great results.
But David, but education and healthcare.
Right, indirect,
economic growth.
Right. But the stuff that had to do with strict economic growth development, some of the white elephant projects, I highly recommend that book called Seeing Like a State, which is about some of the failures of the way governments plan economic growth for other countries. And that details some of the failures we've had in economic aid. So to me, I would not sell it so much as economic aid. I would sell it as healthcare. I would sell it as education. And then I would sell it as another way to export what we have, the one thing we have that they all want.
Besides Springsteen.
Besides Springsteen and the New York Yankees. I'm a Mets fan, by the way, but I face reality. They don't want the Mets. Listen, the way I would think about foreign economic development is through a tradition which has been lost in our own country, but is something which most countries share. And I'll express it through the biography of a guy who happens to be one of my heroes, Alexander Hamilton. When Hamilton was 12, his mom died in the bed next to him. When he was 13, he was adopted by an uncle who committed suicide. When he was 14, he was adopted by his grandparents, both of whom died within a year. So at age 14, he'd lost everything he'd ever had. By 25, he's George Washington's chief of staff. By 35, he's written the Federalist Papers and become a successful lawyer. By 45, he's retired as the most successful Treasury Secretary in U.S. history. He designs a political philosophy that believes in using limited but energetic government to give poor boys and girls like him a chance to succeed. And that's a tradition that has been lost in American political life. Not big government for equality like the Democratic Party, not small government for freedom like the Republican Party, but a third tradition in American life. And if you look at what Hamilton did to nurture development in this country, and what people in the Hamiltonian tradition did, like the Whig Party, the early Republican Party up to Teddy Roosevelt, they did things which seem to me perfectly applicable around the world. Some of the things are like infrastructure spending. Some of the things are human capital spending, land-grant college acts. Some of the things are breaking down the local oligarchs in regions, and Hamilton wanted to take a bat to local oligarchs like Thomas Jefferson. Some of them are what we would now call gender equality issues. We have a pretty good model for how development happens, which is what we used for the first 150 years and which we've now walked away from. To me, it's that social mobility model. People are now tinged on democracy expansion, but they're not tinged on social mobility. And that model seems to me the right model to export.
He also cheated on his wife and died a pauper, and his father-in-law had to bail them out, so, you know.
You know, everyone has sins.
All right, let's open things up to some of your questions. We have 2 microphones here. Yes, ma'am, I will try to pass it over to you, right there in the middle.
Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Coates. I'm with Interaction, which is an association of U.S.-based NGOs. My question is about China. Because if you think of the U.S. as a donor, and you talk, as I recently did, to someone who staffs the African Union and is very active in development in the Seychelles, he sees China as a very powerful donor force, and China is building infrastructure and doing all of these other things. Are we dropping the ball here? Is there a problem around our aid posture as opposed to China's, and are we going to be left behind in a global context?
Can I take that one?
Sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are 2 models. One is called the Beijing Consensus and the Washington Consensus. When we give foreign assistance or any kind of assistance, we do it with a lot of strings attached. You know, we're going to give stuff to a country in Africa, but we want to make sure that there's no child labor involved. We want to give stuff to someplace in Southeast Asia, but we want to make sure that the women have, you know, equal rights in that country. We put a lot of strings, and it takes a long time for our checks to go through and for any project that we're doing to actually reach fruition. The Chinese, on the other hand, they don't care. No strings attached. We don't care what you do with your children. We don't care what you do with your women. We don't care about any of those things. We don't even care if you're polluting the world. What we want is we want your rare earth minerals. What we want is we want to have the oil that your country, and we're going to build that plant, and we're going to do that infrastructure, and we're not going to worry about the environmental impact of it. We're going to do it today. We're going to do it right now. We're probably going to use your laborers, but you know what? We're going to bring in Chinese laborers so we make sure it gets done really quickly. Now, if you talk to people, particularly in Africa, where they're doing this most successfully, the people that I've talked to, government leaders and others, have said, you know what? We'd much rather do business with China. Why? Because that means that our people have jobs quicker, sooner. We don't care if we're being exploited because it's all about a job. We don't really worry about child labor, women, you know, are you doing, you know, genital mutilation of your women? The Chinese don't care about that, and what we really need right now are jobs and food on the table.
But I will say, KT, that just to put it in context, Mercy Corps has actually been working with members of the Chinese, All China Communist Youth Foundation. They're very interested now in learning about good development practices, and I'll tell you why. South Sudan, they had about a dozen of their Chinese workers, as you correctly point out, that they brought into South Sudan to get that oil out, kidnapped.
Yeah.
It was shortly after the U.S. Marines had airlifted a young American who was in Somalia out of the country safely, and the Chinese blogosphere went nuts.
Right.
And was saying, why are the Americans sending in their special forces and the Chinese aren't? So they're beginning to see the light there.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's a real issue, because are we losing out? You know, we're spending a lot of money. The Chinese are spending very little money. You know, I want to talk about the Pakistan thing. I talked to the Pakistani foreign minister right after that happened, and he was very dismissive. And he said, United States, you just gave us some crumbs off your plate. You didn't give us nearly enough. And then there was, I spoke to somebody who's involved in the Chinese aid project. The Chinese didn't spend very much at all. A lot for them, but not in the greater scheme of things. But what they did is they had a plane that would land, and they would take the bales of whatever it was that they were giving them, you know, the containers, and they all had China written on the side. And they then had their film crews, and they were filming the guys who were taking the stuff off the plane, landing it down, putting it down there, it all said China. And then they took those same containers, put them back on the plane, and then they continued to film the next group. So it looked like the Chinese were giving this massive amount of aid. Now, the United States aid went to the same places, the same, flood-ravaged places. We didn't have the cameras. We didn't say made in the USA.
But we're getting better about that.
You know.
But that is something, again, that you all could really do some missionary work on.
But the problem,
we
Cokie,
are
as
getting
you know,
better.
from the development standpoint, is that you have lives at risk, and when you have aid workers in Pakistan in some of these very insecure areas, if you've got big banners that say USAID, you might as well have a bullseye on your back. So those are some of the challenges that our colleagues are dealing with.
But we do now have, sort of like crime scene tape up in some of these places that say, from the people of the United States of America. So there is an attempt to do a little bit better on this.
Question?
Hi, I'm John Glenn. I'm the policy director. I'm monitoring the Twitter account. So I have here from hashtag Deirdre Crow in Columbia, South Carolina, who's apparently watching us online. I think she'd like us to talk a little bit about the presidential campaigns. And she's saying, how important do you think, this panel, it's a question similar to our last one, that foreign policy will be in this cyclical election? Or is it really just all about the economy?
It's all about the economy. But the economy is deeply intertwined with what's happening around the world. I mean, having lived in Greece for 4 years, the idea that what's happening in Greece can affect my 401k is very upsetting to me. And obviously, the foreign policy is totally intertwined with our economic well-being, and I think that's something that the American people need to pay some attention to.
We just did some polling. I was talking actually about the same topic to one of our pollsters at Fox News yesterday, and he said, oh, those dumb Republicans. We've done a lot of polling, and we realized that in the swing states, foreign policy issues are huge, but nobody's really talking about them because everyone assumes it's the economy stupid. So I think that even if there's a crisis, if there's an Iranian crisis,
of course.
Whatever, all of a sudden foreign policy is going to be the one issue and the only issue that makes a difference, because the economy isn't going to change much between now and November. Employment isn't going to change, unemployment isn't going to change, none of these things are going to change. What could change is a national security crisis. But if this pollster is right, that the swing states, independent voters who are the swing voters in the swing states really care about foreign policy, the Republican Party ought to get with it and hammer that issue.
David, you and I were chatting in the green room about the fact you haven't really written that much about foreign policy, and
That's because there's good news. I mean, I'm like the black vulture of death.
That's great.
I agree. I think Angela Merkel has more to do with whether Barack Obama gets reelected than he does. So I do think that matters. On the other hand, we are in a moment of incredible foreign policy consensus. Mitt Romney has been wandering around the country trying to find a place to disagree with Barack Obama. He's desperately trying, and every time he does, he looks like an idiot because he has to say something so far out there on Russia or whatever it is. The fact is, we have a moment of foreign policy consensus, and this is a great blessing. And it's something to be thankful for. And just the final thing I'll be said, we desperately should treasure this consensus and keep these issues out of the election.
Yeah.
4 years ago, the Gates Foundation wanted to spend $20 million putting education into the presidential campaign. And I and a lot of people pleaded with them, please don't do that.
Right.
You do not want these people committing to education positions or foreign aid positions in the heat of a campaign, because whatever the campaign touches, it kills.
But one problem with consensus, again, from the perspective of this group of people here assembled, is that there is a consensus in the country. When you ask people, do you want to cut the deficit? Of course we want to cut the deficit. And then you ask them program by program. You do not get a majority for cutting anything except foreign aid. And then it's 70% for cutting foreign aid. And of course, people think it's a huge proportion of the budget, and you all know it's not. But so that is where a consensus exists, and it's, from my perspective, a negative one.
One quick thing on the cutting of the foreign aid, that's an abstraction. One of the things that's interesting about the Tea Party is the multi-levered mentality of the Tea Party and the Republican Party. So on the one hand, it's very anti-government, and if you elicit the government argument, they do want to cut. It's also extremely socially conservative and evangelical. It's not a libertarian movement the way I thought it was initially. It's a very socially conservative movement, and therefore extremely interested in foreign service, or in service abroad and community service abroad. If you elicit that, you can get quite a great deal of support for some of these programs.
It's an interesting point because, and you mentioned the Gates Foundation a moment ago, they had commissioned this poll by the Winston Group, and they did a really thoughtful poll that came out at the end of last year. And what it showed was that the American public actually doesn't get it. When you talk about foreign aid, they're thinking it's military aid. A lot of them are thinking it's that. So I asked 3 journalists here, how can we do a better job? And by the way, if it was framed as you're going to have an impact with development dollars to stabilize countries around the world, raise up their standard of living and make them better neighbors, future trading partners, they would support it. Why do you think that message is not getting through to Congress and the American?
If you look at defense spending versus foreign aid, defense spending, the Pentagon, I used to work at the Pentagon. Okay, the Pentagon, every time it builds something, it has component parts in 50 states. And it has, every congressional district builds a little bit of that aircraft carrier. And so there's a built-in constituency saying, jobs, jobs, jobs. There's no built-in constituency saying, I really want to get, except maybe the farmers who want to sell wheat to starving countries. But there's no domestic constituency, jobs constituency in favor of foreign aid. But I think the way you do a better job of saying it is, look, we've just been through 2 wars. It was $1.5 trillion, and what do we get for it? I mean, Iraq, probably an Iranian puppet. Afghanistan is going to break into a civil war 6 minutes after we leave, if not before we leave. So I think you could make the argument that it's a lot easier and cheaper to buy friends and kill enemies. And the place I would then immediately focus is Egypt. I think Egypt starts having food shortages by the end of the year. Egypt, the Egyptians, for a whole lot of reasons, decided they were going to grow cotton. So if you have a nice cotton shirt like this gentleman has, it's probably cotton from Egypt, but they stopped growing wheat. Egypt is the world's 2nd largest importer of wheat. If they don't import that wheat, they starve. And they pay for that wheat with foreign money. They're not getting any of that money because nobody's going to the pyramids. They're not getting any foreign investment because it's too chaotic. And rich Egyptians are taking their money out of the country. Egypt does not have enough money to buy wheat by the end of the year. That's where the United States could go in, not with the tanks blazing, not with the guns, not jumping into the middle of a civil conflict that they may or may not have, and just say, here's development assistance. Here, we're going to help you. We've got a lot of wheat. We know how to grow wheat. We're really good at this sort of assistance. And Egypt, I think, could be a friend forever because they're going to start starving by the end of the year.
Any questions? Yes, the gentleman in the front row. And I'm not sure, are you waiting to ask a question, the gentleman who's standing? Oh, okay, terrific. So you'll be next.
This past week, the American...
Could you please state your name?
Hugh Grindstaff, THIS for diplomats. This past weekend, the American Secretary of State Clinton went to Egypt and now is going to Israel to talk about policies. But yesterday, Michelle Bachmann and 4 other Republican congressmen talked about Muslim Brotherhood infiltration of our government. How does that really...
Our government or their government?
Our government. How does that really show the people in the Middle East that we are serious about what we're doing?
Well, I think the Muslim Brotherhood is a real threat, whether it's in Egypt or wherever it is. I'm not sure what Michelle Bachmann was talking about, so I don't want to comment on that. I didn't hear what she said. But the Muslim Brotherhood is, has now won every major election except one in the countries in the Middle East that are having elections, and they're likely to grow. I mean, Jordan is likely to be a destabilized country if you held an election tomorrow. In Syria, you'd probably see, Islamist parties, Islamic parties, whether they're extremist Islamics, who knows. But the Muslim Brotherhood is definitely is a group on the ascendancy. And so I think that the problem that we will face is that people will say, gosh, you can't give any aid to Egypt because it's a Muslim Brotherhood country.
No, she's saying it's Muslim Brotherhood
our country?
I don't know.
I don't know. I didn't see her remarks. I mean, I respect her greatly, but I didn't see her remarks, so I feel
She's not one
awkward
of the
commenting.
contenders anymore.
right.
Yes. Your name, please, and who you're with?
Yeah, Robin Eckstein. I'm a U.S. Army veteran from Wisconsin, so served in
Oh,
Iraq.
good.
I just,
Thank you for your service. Were you deployed once?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, with the 1st Armored Division, so out of Germany. Anyway, I guess I had a comment and kind of question along with that, was just that it was stated before to kind of, give up on Pakistan, move into Egypt. And I guess it really kind of like pinged my heart when you said that, just simply because I don't think that you don't want to give up. In any kind of these regions. And I think especially being a soldier, having been a former soldier and having served in a war zone and having seen when there's not enough foreign aid and not enough action by the U.S. government or by these NGOs in there. When I was in Iraq, I was a truck driver, and I got to see right in 2003, from them waving to us and all happy and cheering that we were there, to them then starting counting the trucks and the IEDs and things like that, and where, if we would have had better, foreign assistance in that country, maybe we could have stopped some of that and kept up the big hurrahs for America coming into that country.
If the post-invasion had been run by state instead of defense, it would have been a better situation.
Exactly, and I guess when I, having experienced that, I think, don't write off any country and any kind of foreign aid like that when it's definitely needed, because even if all those people have gone to these schools and have gotten this training, that doesn't necessarily, you shouldn't write them off. There's still a possibility that some of those people can be turned. And when I look at it, I think seeds in schools are cheaper than bullets. And if you can, make a difference there, then it's, not having to send soldiers like myself or my niece or, anyone else into harm's way again.
Well, which was, of course, yes.
Yeah.
Which was, of course, the point that Secretary Gates made over and over and over again, and has been such a strong voice on smart power. But and I must say that when you talk about giving up on countries, you're really putting women at a terrible danger. And Laura Bush has been such a champion of the women of Afghanistan, and trying to make sure that we continue to pay attention to them. But we can only do that if we're there. And I think that getting across the message that this is something that actually works for us as a country when you go to Capitol Hill tomorrow is very, very important. But I would also say, in reference to what this young woman has said, is that there's a hesitancy on the part of the NGO community and USAID to accept the role that the military is playing in development. And I think that's a big mistake. That's where the money is. One of the best breast cancer programs, for instance, is run by the Department of Defense. Why? Because congresswomen knew that they could get it funded in the defense budget when they couldn't get it funded anyplace else. And that's true about some development work as well. And so I think that, and I'm sure that you can tell us about some of the things that the military is learning to do, and we're seeing it in Afghanistan now, of going in and working in schools and working with women's groups and all of that, and women in the military going in and doing that. And I think that it's something that the traditional development community has to be a great deal more open to.
I think we have time for about one more question, and if it could just be a question for one of the panelists. I don't know who has the microphone now. Is that, yes, sir.
I'm Dennis Higgins, the president of the Student Veterans of America at East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. And I just recently completed a service learning experience in St. Croix where we went and did behavioral health for adults that can't take care of themselves, basically. And after the week we were done, one of the things that we learned was a week isn't enough. Unfortunately, it's mostly funded by the students themselves and the student activities. To get more eager students out to be doing some of this foreign policy, not just in our territories, but in other countries, who should take the lead, and where do you think, especially in these times, the money can come from?
How are these students doing foreign policy?
Just the example was that we were doing behavioral therapy in St. Croix, but you could do this You could do therapy. You can do with
like psychosocial.
Yeah, we could go out to refugee camps and work with, with the proper training leading up to it to do stuff with trauma, things like that to help with maybe or when they're coming as a refugee, if they've had some help, then that's going to help them adjust better.
I'm not so sure that's a question for the panelists, but if you want to
thought,
take a crack at it.
Which is, this is a remarkably service-oriented younger generation.
Right.
Yeah.
If you look at all the social indicators went south in the 1960s, they're all moving in the positive direction because these people are so community-oriented. So teenage pregnancy is down, divorce rates are down, teen suicide is down. They're incredibly responsible. I think they're going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years. But until that moment. And there are two things that they're tremendously interested in. One is that community service. Steve Trachtenberg, who was president of GW University, said here of his students' community service, I don't know where these kids find lepers, but they find them and they read to them, which is a good testament to their service. And second, they're really interested in programs that their peers cannot get into. And so one of the models that's tremendously effective domestically is Teach for America.
Right.
Getting people into Teach for America. There is now being started a group by Barbara Bush, the daughter of the president, not the mother, and others, to create a TFA for foreign activity. And to me, that's the ideal model. Get them to apply, give them training, send them abroad for a year.
And I would add to that any kind of, I really have always believed in national service, not national military service necessarily, although I'm a mother of a Navy lieutenant, but I do think that this is the one moment in the last 30 years where the United States could push for national service, because 50% of high school and college graduates are unemployed, and they stay unemployed for over a year. So unlike 15 years ago when they all thought they were going to have great jobs on Wall Street or wherever they were going, they're now going to mom's couch. And this would be the moment to say to that very motivated generation who are otherwise going to be doing nothing, to say this is the year or two, 18 months, 24 months to go serve your country, whether you do it at Teach for America, whether you do it in inner city schools, whether you do it in the military, or whether you do it, like you're saying, abroad. So I'm all for it.
We have just over a minute left. Do you have a final thought before we wrap this up?
Well, I think that my final thought is I am a terrible Pollyanna. I just have to put that out there, even though I've covered Congress and politics all these years. And I do think that the work that the United States is doing around the world is wonderful work. And I think that the main thing that we need to do is to do more of it and and get the word out. And get the word out both to our own citizens as voters, but also to our elected officials who really don't know the great work that is going on. And I think that that's your mission, and go for it.
Well, please join me in thanking our three fantastic panelists. And I'd like to invite you to go out and peruse this wonderful Smart Power Expo, and at 4 o'clock you're supposed to be back here to see Senators Kerry and Coleman, who are the surrogates for the candidates, talk about their foreign policy. Thank you.